Two main types of classroom arrangements would be rows, groups, or pods. And then I've also got combinations in here because I preferred like a combination deal, because there were times when I like to lecture and there were times when I like to do group work and independent work and things like that. So just we're gonna go through each of them very quickly. Rows, that's pretty self-explanatory. You can see there the picture, the tables are in rows. This is typically used in high school and middle school. I will say that there has definitely been a resurgence of this style since COVID, from pre-K all the way up. Again, I don't find this a bad method as long as you're good at what you're doing. This teaching style complements those of you who like to lecture, and it complements other teacher-led or teacher-directed styles. Perhaps you're doing a teacher-led lab where you're saying, do this step, okay, now do this step, now do this step. So it's a little more of a directed method versus they're working on their own. Got some ratings for you of student management ease. As far as classroom management goes, I would say that this is on the easier scale. Kids tend to be in their own little boxes and they don't tend to pick and knit and goof with each other as much because they have their own little defined spaces. Here you can see the ratings of student engagements. If you're doing the lecture style, student engagement tends to be the least until you get very good at it. This tends to be where students, they're not always motivated to participate, they're not always motivated to interact in the lesson. So keep that in mind as you're planning. Let's look at groups and pods. These are typically used in elementary schools and middle schools. Certain high school classroom activities and classroom structures, it does lend itself to this, but typically you'll see this in elementary and middle school buildings. The teaching style it complements would be group work, having them do collaboration. If you are into centers or rotations or stations, labs, these all work really, really well for placing your students in groups or pods. Groups or pods, rating of student management ease. These are definitely on the harder scale. Kids do tend to talk more and interact more, which is why we put them in groups and pods, but then it can also lead to problems. So you got to know that going into it, that the classroom management is going to be harder here because they are in groups, and so they are going to naturally socialize and pick and poke and all the things that we don't like. So with the good is going to come some bad. Student engagement rating. Kids are typically more engaged because we're allowing them to participate in the activity. We're allowing them to talk about what's happening. We're allowing them to do things. Keeping in mind that this student engagement piece is the most when you're good at classroom management. But if you're not good at classroom management, it goes whoop, really fast back down to the other side. And it can be the worst and the least effective for classroom management, and definitely lower than lecture, because what can happen is your kids will just socialize and just do the things they're not supposed to be doing, and because you're in groups or pods, you may not notice. So making sure that when you're setting things up that you're keeping that in mind, you're going to tackle that and you're going to set up the room very strategically so that you can see where the problem areas might be and you fix it before it ever even happens. You're like, oh, I'm on to you. I know if you go over in that corner, you're likely going to goof around and misbehave, so you might set up the room slightly differently. My favorite is combination. I think a lot of teachers do use this. So there's a combination of a lecture and groups or pods. You introduce the lesson in a lecture sort of style, do some quick mini lessons or some micro lessons, and you get through the topics of the day. You give some instruction on what the centers are going to be, and then they go out and they participate in the centers and the groups. That can be a very effective way of teaching. Again, there's some good and there's some bad in that, because When you're lecturing, you're very likely got a good control on what's happening with the kids, but as soon as they go out and they're working in their groups and their pods, the classroom management piece is going to be harder, and you're going to have to keep that in mind and organize your room accordingly.